The night the bridge spoke, a true story about fear, courage, and moving forward. I grew up in a town that many would describe as forgettable. It wasn't famous for anything. No historic landmarks, no glamorous festivals, no reason for outsiders to visit. But for those of us who lived there, it was home. The streets were narrow and familiar, the shops small but reliable, and the people, though often busy with their own worries, always seemed to know one another's business. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, though not necessarily gentler. For me, adulthood in that town felt less like living and more like enduring. Every day blurred into the next. Wake up, go to work, return home exhausted, repeat. I was working a job that didn't inspire me, surrounded by people who didn't truly see me, and carrying expectations that seemed heavier with each passing year. My parents, though well-meaning, often reminded me of all the things I should be doing by now. My boss only noticed the mistakes I made, never the effort I put in. My friends were chasing lives outside of town, while I remained stuck, tethered to routines that drained me dry. It was during this period of quiet desperation that I began to notice how much the world around me reflected the weight I carried inside. The once charming streets of my childhood now looked suffocating. The small shops that once felt cozy now felt limiting. Even the trees that lined the main road seemed to lean over me, as if pressing down on my shoulders. And, of course, there was the bridge. The old iron bridge sat on the edge of town, spanning a shallow river that rarely rushed and mostly trickled. By daylight, it was nothing remarkable: rusting beams, weather-beaten boards, and graffiti that changed every few years when local teenagers grew bold enough. But at night, the bridge seemed to awaken. The beams groaned in the cold wind, shadows stretched longer than they should, and the river beneath whispered like something alive. People in town had endless stories about it. Some said that cars stalled without warning on its planks. Others swore they had heard voices calling their names when they crossed after dark. A few even claimed to see figures, shadows that stood still until you blinked and then vanished. As children, we traded these stories like candy, each one scarier than the last. As adults, most of us laughed them off as folklore, something to entertain ourselves with during long winters. But deep down, I think we all knew there was something unsettling about that bridge, something that couldn't be fully explained by rust and wood. The night my story takes place, I was carrying more than exhaustion with me. I was carrying the feeling that my life was standing still, that I was watching the world move on without me. I had stayed late at work, long after the last of my coworkers left, staring at a computer screen filled with numbers that meant nothing to me. By the time I finally stood up to leave, my eyes were aching, my shoulders stiff, and my mind drowning in questions I couldn't answer. Why was I still here? Why did I keep doing this, day after day? Was this really all life had to offer me? The streets were empty when I drove out of the office parking lot. Lamps flickered along the sidewalks, casting pools of yellow light that only deepened the shadows between them. I rolled down my window, hoping the cold night air might clear my thoughts, but instead it carried with it the silence of a town already asleep. As the road led me out toward the outskirts, I knew I was heading toward the bridge. Most nights, I hardly gave it a thought. It was just part of the route home. But that night, I felt a tightening in my chest as soon as I saw its silhouette rising against the horizon. The headlights caught its rusted beams, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of every story I had ever heard about it. My rational mind told me it was just steel and wood, nothing more. But my heart was not convinced. I slowed the car slightly, my fingers tapping nervously against the wheel. I thought about turning back, taking the longer road home that wound through the hills. But I didn't. I pressed forward, convincing myself it was nothing. Just another night. Just another crossing. Little did I know, that night the bridge had something to say. The tires rolled onto the wooden planks with a hollow thud, and at once, the air around me seemed heavier. The sound of my engine echoed strangely, bouncing off the iron beams in a way that made it feel like I wasn't alone. The headlights illuminated the fog that lingered low over the river, giving the illusion that I was driving through a tunnel of ghosts. Halfway across, it happened. The engine sputtered once, coughed, and then died. The headlights blinked out, plunging me into darkness so complete it made my chest tighten. The only light came faintly from the moon, casting silvery shapes across the beams and boards. For a moment, I sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel as though it might anchor me to something real. The silence was overwhelming, so deep that I could hear the creak of the bridge under my car, the faint ripple of water below, and even the pounding of my own heart. I turned the key again. Nothing. The dashboard remained dark, the car lifeless. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind. I remembered every story I'd ever heard, every whisper passed down through generations about engines dying right here, about people hearing things they shouldn't. And then, just as I was convincing myself it was a mechanical failure, I heard it. At first, it was faint, so faint that I almost mistook it for the wind. A murmur, like a word stretched thin and carried across the planks. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then it came again, louder, more distinct. Not the wind, not the groan of metal. A voice. It didn't sound like any particular person. It wasn't male or female, young or old. It was more like the echo of thought given sound, a whisper rising from the dark itself. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable, low, urgent, insistent. My skin crawled. I glanced in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing behind the car. Nothing. Just fog and shadow. Keep going. The words formed clearly now, spoken in a voice that felt like it came from both inside and outside of me. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled on the wheel. Keep going. The bridge groaned under a gust of wind, as if agreeing. The boards beneath the tires creaked like footsteps moving closer, though I was the only one there. I shut my eyes tightly, but that only made it worse. The darkness pressed closer, and the whisper became louder, overlapping itself like a chorus of my own fears. I thought of my life, the endless hours at work, the disappointment in my parents' eyes, the feeling that I was stuck in a loop I couldn't escape. The voice seemed to feed on those thoughts, weaving them into its message. You are afraid. The words weren't shouted, but they thundered inside me. My breath caught. My chest tightened, as if invisible hands were pressing against it. I shook my head, whispering to myself, no, I'm just tired. I'm imagining this. But the voice didn't stop. You are stuck. You are afraid. But you must move forward. Tears stung my eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of the truth pressing down on me. I realized then that the voice wasn't some ghostly presence. It was me. It was my own fears, my own doubts, amplified by the silence of that bridge. The place wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by the reflections of those who carried their own shadows across it. The silence after that revelation was deafening. I could hear my breathing, ragged and shallow. My hands slipped from the wheel to my lap, trembling. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, maybe longer. The night stretched endlessly, as if time itself had stalled along with the car. Finally, with a shaking hand, I reached for the ignition again. My heart pounded as I turned the key. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. And then, the engine roared to life. The dashboard lit up. The headlights cut through the fog like blades. Relief washed over me so powerfully that I let out a laugh. Half hysteria, half gratitude. I pressed my foot on the gas, and the car began to roll forward. Each board groaned under the tires, but the sound was no longer sinister. It was steady, reassuring, like footsteps carrying me to safety. By the time I reached the other side, my body was shaking, my clothes damp with sweat. But something inside me had shifted. The voice lingered in my mind, not as a threat, but as a truth I could no longer ignore. Fear wasn't the enemy. Stopping was. When the wheels finally touched solid ground again, I pulled over to the side of the road and let the car idle. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, and my breath came in uneven gasps. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The bridge stood behind me, dark and silent, its frame outlined in pale moonlight. From a distance, it looked harmless again, just rusted beams and weathered wood. And yet, to me, it was no longer just a bridge. It was a mirror that had forced me to look at myself in a way I had been avoiding for years. I stayed there for a long time, the engine humming quietly, until the panic began to ebb and my heart found a steadier rhythm. Slowly, the fear gave way to something else, something gentler, but no less powerful. A kind of clarity. I realized that the voice hadn't come from the bridge at all. It had come from me, from the part of me that I had been ignoring while drowning myself in work, in obligations, in the expectations of everyone but myself. It was the part of me that wanted more than just to exist. The part that wanted to live. Keep going, it had said. And I understood now. Not just across the bridge, but in life. Even when I felt stuck. Even when I felt afraid. Especially then. The days that followed weren't magical. My job was still stressful. My family still asked questions that cut too deep. I still felt small in a world that demanded more than I thought I could give. But something inside me had shifted. I began to notice the small things again. The way the morning light filtered through the kitchen window, the smell of fresh coffee, the laughter of a stranger passing me on the street. I started writing again, something I had abandoned years ago when life became too heavy. I reached out to an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. None of it was dramatic. None of it solved my problems overnight. But each step felt like crossing another plank on that bridge, steady, deliberate, forward. And every time fear threatened to paralyze me, I remembered that night. I remembered the silence, the whisper, the sudden weight in my chest. And I reminded myself that fear wasn't a wall, it was a signpost. It was proof that I was standing at the edge of something important. Years later, I still carry that lesson with me. I've shared the story a few times, usually with people who, like me, felt like their lives had stalled in the middle of their own bridge. I don't dress it up with ghost stories or supernatural warnings. I tell it as it was, a night when the darkness forced me to listen, and when my own voice became the push I needed to keep moving. And so, if you ever find yourself stuck, staring into the fog of your own doubts, hearing the whispers of everything that scares you, remember this: the bridge only feels endless when you stop in the middle. Keep going, because on the other side, you might just find yourself again.